For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Pain. It tore through David Mitchell like a wildfire. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body barely clinging to consciousness as the wreckage of his ship floated in the cold abyss. The last thing he remembered was the enemy's ion cannon striking his hull, alarms screaming in his ears, flames licking at his cockpit. His fingers had barely reached for the eject lever before blackness. Now, something was different. The air was too thick. The scent of metal and something faintly sweet filled his lungs. It wasn't the cold vacuum of space. He was alive. His eyelids felt weighted, but he forced them open. He was on a medical table, his body stiff, covered only by a thin silver sheet. Not dead. Not in enemy hands either. Then where? A shadow moved in his periphery. David turned his head, wincing as his muscles protested. His gaze locked onto a figure standing just beyond the light, and then he saw her. Her long, golden yellow hair cascaded past her shoulders, stark against her dark skin. But it was her eyes that trapped him, jet black, glossy like obsidian, watching him with an intensity that made his breath hitch. She was beautiful. "You are awake," she said, her voice a low, velvety hum. David swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "Where am I?" She stepped closer, and the soft rustle of fabric told him she wore something sleek, form-fitting but modest. A uniform of some kind. A doctor. "You are in a Xelari medical facility," she answered smoothly, lifting a small device that pulsed with blue light over his chest. "Your ship was destroyed. We found you drifting." Xelari. He had heard of theme and enigmatic species, technologically superior, but notoriously reclusive. So why had they saved him? David's mind worked fast. His body was wrecked. He should be dead. His pulse quickened. How am I alive? Then she exhaled. "Because I gave you my blood." Silence. David blinked. His mind struggled to process the words. "What?" She set the device down, tilting her head slightly. "Your injuries were beyond repair. Our medical technology could not stabilize you in time. The only way to save you was to transfuse my blood into your system." His breath hitched. "That's not possible." Her lips plump, painted a deep shade of violet pressed together. "It should not be." David's fingers clenched against the sheet. His body felt different, stronger, as if something unfamiliar had settled beneath his skin. A thought struck him. What does your blood do to humans?" She hesitated again, her black eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then she leaned closer, the scent of something warm and floral radiating from her skin. "My name is Emily," she murmured, her gaze locking onto his. "And my blood did not just heal you." David's chest tightened. "Then what did it do?" A beat of silence. Then she whispered, "It bonded us." "What?" Her expression remained unreadable, but there was something else in her eyes now, something dangerous. "Human biology is incompatible with Xelari blood," she continued, "or so we believed. But our kind does not reproduce as yours does. Our DNA merges differently, and when we share blood..." David suddenly felt too hot. His skin tingled, his veins thrumming with an energy he didn't recognize. Emily's lips parted. "Your body has already begun reacting, and soon you will understand." Understand what? He opened his mouth to demand answers, but before he could, a sharp wave of something foreign pulsed through him, hot, electric, undeniable. And the way Emily was watching him now, with knowing intensity, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer, but it was already too late. The change had begun. David's breath came hard and fast. His body felt like it was on fire. He clenched his fists, gritting his teeth against the overwhelming surge coursing through his veins. Emily stood beside him, watching. What's happening to me?" His voice was rough, strained. His skin tingled, as if something inside him had been unlocked. Emily exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Your body is adjusting to the bond." The bond! He tried to sit up, but the moment he moved, his vision swam, and a sharp pulse tore through his limbs. His grip on the edge of the medical table tightened. "You are not human anymore." "Not fully." David stilled. The weight of her words slammed into him. He had known something was off the second he woke up. His wounds should have left him incapacitated, his body too broken to function, but he felt stronger, different. His gaze snapped up to her, eyes narrowing. "You knew this would happen." Emily didn't flinch. "I suspected." A slow, frustrated growl built in his throat. "You didn't think to warn me?" Her expression remained composed, but there was something beneath it, a flicker of uncertainty. "There was no time," she said simply. "If I had not given you my blood, you would have died. David pushed himself up, forcing his body to obey. His muscles protested, but the pain was already fading, replaced by something else. A thrumming energy beneath his skin, a heightened awareness of everything around him. The air was sharper, the sounds crisper, even the way Emily moved, the faintest shift of her weight. The way her golden hair brushed against her shoulders, she noticed all of it, in perfect clarity. This wasn't just healing, it was transformation, and she knew it. His fingers flexed against the table, his breath steadying. "You still haven't told me what this bond means." Emily stepped closer, her black eyes, dark pools of something he couldn't decipher. "Xelari do not reproduce like humans. We do not," she hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully, "create life in the same way." David frowned. "Then how?" "Our blood carries more than just DNA. It carries essence. When shared, it binds us. It makes us compatible." His stomach tightened. "Compatible?" Emily's gaze held his, unwavering. "I am carrying your offspring." Silence. The words hit him harder than a bullet. David's pulse hammered. He stared at her, his mind refusing to process what she had just said. It was impossible. It was insane. "You're lying," he said, but there was no certainty in his voice. Emily tilted her head. "Your body already knows the truth." His breathing was too fast, too unsteady. He wanted to deny it, to fight it, but deep inside, something in him did know. The heat in his veins, the way his body responded to her presence, the way he could feel her heartbeat even across the room, none of it was natural. It wasn't human, and that terrified him. David pushed off the table, forcing himself to move. He needed distance, space to think. But the moment he took a step, his legs wavered, and Emily was there, her hands firm against his arms, steadying him. "Easy," she murmured, her voice smooth but commanding. "Your body is still adjusting." David's jaw clenched. He hated this hated feeling powerless. His life, his choices, his very self all altered by a decision that wasn't his own. He tore his arm from her grasp, stepping back. "What the hell did you do to me?" "Emily, I saved you." His vision sharpened, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get away from her. But where would he go? He was on an alien ship, surrounded by a species that didn't trust humans. And now, because of her, he wasn't even fully human anymore. His hands curled into fists. "Undo it." She shook her head. "It cannot be undone." His chest tightened. "Then fix it." "There is nothing to fix," she said calmly. David swallowed hard. He had survived wars, watched friends die, fought against impossible odds. But this was a battle he had already lost before he even knew it had begun. He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his short, dark hair. "You don't understand. I didn't sign up for this. I can't." Emily studied him. "You feel it, don't you?" David's lips pressed into a thin line, the fire in his blood. It wasn't just about the physical changes. It was something deeper. Her voice softened, just slightly. "You cannot fight it, David." His breath hitched. For the first time since waking up, he realized the truth. It wasn't just his body that had changed. It was his mind. The bond was already there, threading between them like an invisible tether. No matter how much he wanted to fight it, he couldn't ignore the way his entire being reacted to her, the way her presence felt like a gravitational pull, drawing him in even as he tried to resist. His fists unclenched, his breathing slowed, and he knew he was already hers, whether he wanted to be or not. David had fought impossible battles before. He had survived wars, betrayals, but this was something else entirely. The battle was inside him now. His body wasn't his own anymore. It responded to Emily's presence in ways he didn't understand, ways he didn't want to acknowledge. His senses were sharper, more attuned, and worst of all, he could feel her heartbeat. Not just hear it, but feel it inside him, as if it were synced with his own. As if his body had already accepted something he was still fighting to reject. His jaw clenched. "This isn't right." Emily stood across from him, calm, unreadable. She had barely moved since she'd told him the truth. "That does not change what is," she said. David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You think that makes it better? That I'm just supposed to what? Accept this? Accept that He swallowed hard. "That you're carrying my..." He couldn't even say it. The words felt like too much, too heavy. "You are resisting something that cannot be undone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Your body knows what has happened. It is only your mind that refuses to accept it." David's muscles tensed. "Because I didn't choose this." Emily's black eyes locked onto his. Neither did I. The words landed like a blow. For the first time, he saw it, the flicker of something beneath her controlled exterior. She had taken a risk, a desperate one, and now they were both bound to the consequences. The tension between them was thick, an invisible thread stretched too tight. David took a slow breath, forcing his mind to work through the chaos in his head. "You said your people don't reproduce like humans," he muttered. "Explain it to me, all of it." Emily studied him for a long moment before answering. "Our species does not rely on physical reproduction. Our DNA is transferred through blood, through the sharing of essence," she said. "When I gave you my blood, it did not just heal you. It merged with your genetic structure, adapted to your biology. And in doing so, it created something new." David's stomach clenched. "You mean," he swallowed, "you're actually pregnant?" Emily tilted her head slightly. "Pregnancy is a human term. Our kind does not carry offspring in the same way. But yes." David took a step back, his mind spinning. "Impossible," he muttered. Emily arched a brow. "And yet, it has happened." His hands clenched at his sides. "I don't even know you. How the hell am I supposed to?" He cut himself off, his chest tightening. David turned sharply, moving toward the exit of the medbay. But before he could take more than a few steps, something stopped him. A sharp pulse shot through his veins, like an electric current ripping through his body. He staggered, his breath hitching. "What the hell?" His entire body went rigid, his vision blurred, and when he blinked, the only thing in focus was her, Emily. His pulse pounded in sync with hers, the invisible thread between them tightening. It hit him then. The bond. It wasn't just some abstract connection. It was real, and it was affecting him in ways he couldn't control. He was reacting to her physically. And worse? She knew it. Emily watched him carefully, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her posture, something expectant. "You are feeling it now," she murmured. David gritted his teeth. "Make it stop." Emily exhaled through her nose. "It will not stop. The more you fight it, the stronger it will become." Emily stepped closer, and the fire inside him flared. His breath turned shallow. "You are not just human anymore," she said. "The bond is part of you now." David forced himself to stay still, to not give in to whatever instinct was screaming at him, to close the distance between them. "How long?" he asked through gritted teeth. Emily studied him. "How long will this feeling last?" He nodded stiffly. Her lips parted slightly. "That depends on you." His pulse hammered. "What does that mean?" She took another step forward, the space between them too close now. "It means the bond must be completed." David swallowed hard. "Define completed." Emily tilted her head, watching him with those dark, unreadable eyes. But she didn't answer, because they both already knew. The fire inside him refused to die. David had spent the last hour pacing the medbay, hands clenched, body tense with a restless energy that refused to settle. And the worst part? She was watching him. Emily stood near the console, arms crossed, her expression calm, composed, like she wasn't feeling this at all, like the burning in his blood was a problem for him alone. "This is a joke. It has to be." Emily didn't react. David turned to face her, his pulse hammering in his throat. "You knew this would happen. You knew His voice faltered, "that I'd feel like this." Emily's black eyes locked onto his. "Yes." His fists clenched. "Then you should have warned me." "It would not have changed the outcome," she replied, stepping closer, her presence unnervingly steady. "Your body is reacting as it must." "As it must?" "You talk like this is some kind of biological destiny, but I'm not Xelari, and I sure as hell don't believe in fate." Emily studied him. "It is not fate. It is science." David let out a rough laugh, pacing away from her. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" She didn't respond. The heat inside him only grew stronger, like an invisible tether pulling him toward her. It was more than desire, more than instinct. He turned sharply to face her. "Tell me how to stop it." Emily tilted her head slightly. "You cannot." David's pulse slammed against his ribs. "So what? I just have to live with this bond." His voice was raw, edged with frustration. "Feeling like my own body isn't mine anymore?" Her gaze was unreadable. "Your body is still yours, David, but it has changed. You are not fighting me. You are fighting what you have become. And what the hell is that?" Emily took a deliberate step forward, her golden hair catching the light. More. His instincts screamed that she was right. He felt it with every heartbeat, every cell, every inhale that made her scent sharper, more consuming. He wanted to deny it. Emily watched him, waiting, her patience infinite. But there was something else beneath her composure, something he hadn't noticed before. She was holding back. The realization sent a shock through him. He wasn't the only one feeling this. His breath slowed. "It's affecting you too." Emily blinked. "Yes." David swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Then why aren't you?" "Because I have lived with this knowledge for far longer than you." The words landed heavily. David stared at her. He had been so consumed by his own struggle, by his own loss of control, that he hadn't considered hers. She had bonded with him just as much as he had with her, but she wasn't fighting it because she had known it was inevitable. His chest rose and fell, breath steadying. "What happens if I stop fighting?" Emily exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for that question. "Then the bond will settle. The pain will pass. And if I don't?" She held his gaze, steady. "Then it will consume you." Silence stretched between them. David turned away, hands braced against the edge of the medical table, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. His whole life had been a fight, against enemies, against the odds, against fate. But this was a fight he couldn't win. And maybe, for the first time in his life, he wasn't supposed to. He looked over his shoulder, meeting Emily's gaze. David stood in the silence of the medbay, his hands braced against the edge of the table, his breaths uneven. The fire in his blood still burned, but it had shifted. It wasn't just wild, chaotic energy anymore. It was something alive, something he could feel moving inside him, adapting, waiting, for him to accept it. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus. He had spent his life resisting pain, resisting death, resisting anything that threatened to take control away from him. But this wasn't a war he could win through force. Emily had said as much. "The bond will settle when you stop fighting it." David exhaled, steadying himself, then turned to face her. She hadn't moved. She still stood in the same place, her posture controlled, her expression unreadable. But something was different now. He could feel it. The space between them wasn't just empty air, it was charged, the invisible thread connecting them tightening with every breath. "You're sure about this?" His voice was low, cautious. Emily's black eyes met his. "Yes." David swallowed hard. His fingers flexed against the table, his instincts battling his reason one last time. Then slowly, he nodded. The moment the resistance left him, it was like a switch had been flipped. The heat in his veins stopped burning, and instead, settled into something else. Something warmer, smoother, coiling beneath his skin like liquid energy. His muscles stopped trembling, the ache in his bones vanished, and in its place was a strange, intoxicating sense of clarity. And just like that, the fire became part of him. David exhaled sharply, his senses sharpened, his heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of something new. He didn't feel like he was losing control anymore. He felt stronger. Emily tilted her head slightly, watching him with careful interest. "It is done." David swallowed, rolling his shoulders as he took stock of himself. The exhaustion was gone, the discomfort replaced by a feeling of balance. He looked down at his hands. They still looked like his hands. He still felt like himself. And yet, something fundamental had changed. His eyes flicked back to Emily. "So, now what?" Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to ask that. Then she took a slow step forward. "Now, we find out what you have become." The medical bay had been silent before. Now it hummed with low energy as Emily ran a series of scans on David, her golden hair glowing faintly under the soft overhead lights. David sat on the examination table, watching as holographic displays flickered to life around him, showing streams of data in an alien language he couldn't read. Emily's brow furrowed as she studied the results. David arched an eyebrow. "Not the reaction I was hoping for." She glanced at him. "Your body has adapted faster than I anticipated." "Good or bad?" Emily hesitated. "Unpredictable." David let out a slow breath, running a hand down his face. "Great. Love hearing that." She didn't respond, instead swiping through the data on the screen, her black eyes sharp with calculation. Then she froze. David noticed immediately. "What?" She didn't answer at first. Then slowly, she turned to face him. "Your genetic structure is no longer entirely human," she said. His stomach tightened. "Meaning?" Emily stepped closer, her gaze intense. "You are stronger than you were before. Your neurological patterns have altered. Your senses have expanded beyond human limitations. Your cells are regenerating faster than they should." David's pulse picked up. "You're saying I'm something new," Emily interrupted. "Something neither fully human nor fully Xelari." David swallowed. "A hybrid." His mind raced through the implications, but before he could process them, the medbay doors slid open with a soft hiss. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, elegant, skin the same deep shade of violet as Emily's, but with sharp, more angular features. His uniform bore the insignia of authority, his black eyes narrowing the moment they landed on David. Emily immediately straightened. "Commander Voris," she greeted. David tensed. So this was one of her people, and he didn't look happy. Voris stepped into the room, his presence commanding. "Dr. Emily," he said coolly, his gaze flicking between her and David. "Explain this." Emily remained calm, but David noticed the slight stiffness in her posture. "I saved him," she said. "There were no other options." Voris's lips pressed into a thin line. "And now you have bonded with him." David clenched his jaw. He knew. Emily exhaled. It was unintentional. Voris's expression remained unreadable. Then he turned his gaze fully onto David. "And you? How much do you understand of what has been done to you?" David didn't flinch. He met the commander's stare evenly. "Enough to know I didn't have a choice." Voris studied him for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. "Your presence here is dangerous, human. Our people do not form bonds with outsiders. It is forbidden." David arched an eyebrow. "Then why did Emily risk it?" Emily stiffened slightly, but Voris only tilted his head. "That is the question we are all asking." The unspoken words hung in the air. Why did Emily save him? David glanced at her, but her expression remained impassive. Even she didn't know. Voris exhaled, turning back to Emily. "The council will want answers." Emily nodded. "I expected as much." Voris's gaze flicked back to David. "You will not be permitted to leave." David's jaw tightened. "I didn't exactly plan on going anywhere." Voris studied him, then gave a curt nod. "Then prepare yourself, human, because the council will determine whether you are allowed to exist at all." David's blood ran cold. Voris turned sharply and exited the room, the doors sliding shut behind him. Silence. David exhaled slowly, turning to Emily. "So, let me guess." She met his gaze. "This is the part where things get worse?" Emily's lips pressed together. "Yes." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Perfect." The tension in the air was suffocating. David stood in the center of a vast chamber, surrounded by towering figures with violet skin and piercing black eyes. The Xelari High Council, looking down at him like a specimen under a microscope. He had been in high-stakes interrogations before. He had been captured, tortured, and questioned by enemies of the Terran Federation. But this felt different. This wasn't about strategy. This was about whether they would let him live. Emily stood at his side, her posture rigid. She was the only reason he was still breathing, and he knew it. At the center of the council sat an elder Xelari, his skin a darker shade of purple, his eyes impossibly deep, the one who would decide David's fate. Emily had introduced him as Counselor Riven. Riven's gaze bore into David. "You are an anomaly, human," he said, his voice low and controlled. "A mistake that should not exist." David clenched his jaw but forced himself to remain calm. "I didn't ask for this," he said evenly. Riven tilted his head slightly. "And yet, it has happened. You have been altered. You carry the essence of our kind. You are something neither Xelari nor fully human." A hybrid murmurs spread through the chamber. Some of the council members whispered to each other, their expressions unreadable. "So what happens now?" A different counselor, a woman with sharp features and a cold stare, leaned forward. "That depends on whether you are a threat to our people." "I didn't ask to be part of your species," he said. "But if you're worried I'm some kind of weapon, I can tell you right now, I don't even know what I am yet." "That is precisely the concern. We do not know what you are either." David swallowed hard. "Yeah, that sounded bad." Emily finally spoke. "The bond has stabilized. His body has accepted the transformation. There have been no adverse effects." Riven's dark gaze shifted to her. "And yet you cannot say with certainty what he will become." David frowned. "What I will become." The word sent a chill through him. Riven exhaled. "There is precedent for this. When one of our kind is altered beyond recognition, when they become something other, we do not allow them to remain among us." David's muscles tensed. "You mean you execute them?" Riven didn't blink. "Yes." The word landed like a gunshot. David forced himself to stay still, but his pulse was hammering. He could feel the energy inside him react, stirring beneath his skin. Emily straightened. "If we act hastily, we may lose the opportunity to understand what he is. He is no ordinary human anymore. His survival alone proves that." A counselor on the far right scoffed. You speak as if this is a miracle rather than an abomination. Emily's jaw tightened. Perhaps it is both. Riven studied her for a long moment, then shifted his gaze back to David. You feel it, don't you? He asked. David swallowed. Feel what? Riven's lips barely moved. The change. David exhaled. I feel a lot of things I don't understand right now. Riven nodded slowly. Which means you are not done changing. David's fingers twitched at his sides. He wasn't an idiot that could feel something growing inside him, something not entirely human, but whether it was power, instinct, or something worse, he had no idea. Riven turned back to the council. We will not make a decision today. David let out a slow breath, but Riven wasn't done. But he will remain under observation, closely monitored. If there are any signs that he is losing control, we will eliminate the threat. David forced himself to stay still, but his hands curled into fists at his sides. Emily, however, lifted her chin. I will take responsibility for him. Riven's gaze sharpened. Are you certain? Emily didn't hesitate. Yes. The council exchanged glances. Then Riven nodded. Very well. But understand, Dr. Emily, if he becomes a danger, it will be your failure. Emily inclined her head. I understand. Riven turned his dark gaze to David one last time. Do not give us a reason to regret this decision, human. The council session ended. David exhaled as the murmuring Xelari filed out of the chamber. Emily remained at his side, her body rigid. David turned to her. What the hell just happened? Emily finally looked at him. You've been given a chance. Do not waste it. David sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, in the quarters Emily had led him to, elbows braced on his knees, fingers clasped tightly. His mind was still spinning from the council's verdict. He wasn't going to be executed, but he wasn't free either. They would watch him, study him, wait for the moment he lost control. And if he did, they would end him without hesitation. The air in the room felt heavy. It wasn't confinement in the traditional sense. There were no restraints, no visible guards standing at the door, but he wasn't naive. They were watching. Emily stood near the console, her gaze locked on him like she was waiting for him to break. Say it, David muttered, running a hand over his face. Emily, say what? Whatever you're thinking. She hesitated, tilting her head slightly. You are handling this better than I expected. David let out a sharp, humorless laugh. That makes one of us. Silence stretched between them. Emily exhaled, crossing her arms. You are processing, David scoffed. Processing? He lifted his head, fixing her with a pointed stare. I just got told I might not be human anymore, that my body isn't mine, that I'm bound to you, and that if I so much as twitch the wrong way, I'll be executed. So yeah, Emily, I'm processing. Emily's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in her posture, a flicker of understanding. She simply acknowledged what he was feeling as real, and for some reason, that pissed him off more than if she had tried to comfort him. He pushed himself off the platform, pacing the length of the room. I spent my entire life knowing exactly who I was. A soldier, a survivor, someone who fought for control over his own damn fate. But now, he turned sharply, pinning her with his gaze. Now I'm something else, something I don't understand. And the worst part? His fingers curled into fists. I can feel it. Emily tilted her head. Describe it. It's like, my body isn't just mine anymore. I move, I breathe, I think, but there's something underneath it, something awake, like a second heartbeat I can't ignore. Emily's black eyes flickered with something unreadable. That is the bond. David swallowed hard. And that means what exactly? Emily took a slow step forward. It means you are no longer just human, and you are still changing. David clenched his jaw. Still changing. He exhaled, forcing his hands to relax. And you? Are you feeling it too? Emily hesitated. Yes. That one word sent a shiver down his spine. She was feeling it too. David narrowed his eyes. You're not fighting it. Emily blinked slowly. Why would I? His pulse ticked up. Because it's not normal. Emily studied him for a long moment, then said, It is normal for me. David let out a slow breath. Right. Because your people do this all the time. Number they do not. He stared at her, his heart pounding. Then what the hell makes this different? Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the space between them with slow, deliberate steps. When she was standing directly in front of him, she looked up, her black eyes locked onto his. And for the first time, David saw it. The truth. You don't know, he whispered. Emily didn't deny it. She had done this. She had bonded him to her. She had saved his life, knowing the consequences, but she had no idea what would happen next. David swallowed hard. You took a risk on me. Emily's voice was steady, but he could hear the weight beneath it. Yes. David exhaled. His whole body felt wired, on edge, like something inside him was demanding a response, demanding answers. He took a slow step back, raking a hand through his hair. So, what happens now? Emily straightened, her golden hair shifting over her shoulders. Now, we find out exactly what you have become. David let out a slow breath. And for the first time since waking up, he wasn't just reacting anymore. He was ready to find out the truth. David sat in silence, staring at his hands. They looked the same, calloused, scarred, human. Not anymore. He could feel the difference. The way his breath felt sharper, deeper, more measured. His body no longer moved the way it used to. It was faster, stronger, more attuned to things he couldn't explain. And worst of all, the bond. Always there, silent thread woven between him and Emily. It wasn't just awareness anymore. It was a presence, something alive beneath his skin, responding to her in ways that unsettled him. Across the room, Emily sat at the sleek console, her black eyes scanning through an endless stream of data. She hadn't spoken in the last hour. She didn't need to. David could feel her thoughts moving. And that was the problem. This bond, how deep does it go? Emily turned to face him. Deeper than you are prepared for. David's stomach tightened. That wasn't an answer. He pushed himself to his feet, his muscles tense. So, what? You can feel everything I feel? Emily's gaze remained steady. Not everything. Only the parts that matter. David exhaled slowly. The parts that matter. He didn't like the way that sounded. Emily studied him for a moment before standing as well. Your body is still adapting. We need to assess the changes properly. David scoffed. Yeah? And how do you plan to do that? Emily tapped a command into the console. The walls of their quarters shifted, reforming into a training chamber, an open, sterile space lined with flickering energy panels. David sighed. Of course. Emily gestured toward the center of the room. You must understand your limits before the council decides them for you. He knew what that meant. If he lost control, they would kill him. So he nodded, stepping forward. Let's get this over with. A low hum filled the chamber. From the opposite end, a holographic figure materialized, tall, lean, glowing with Xelari energy. It was an opponent built from light and data, programmed to adapt to his every move. Emily's voice was calm, measured. Your instincts have changed. Do not resist them. David exhaled, eyes locked on the simulation. Easy for her to say. Then the enemy moved. It was too fast for a human opponent. But David's body reacted before his mind could process it. He sidestepped the attack effortlessly, pivoting on his heel and driving his fist into the enemy's chest. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber. David blinked. He hadn't hit that hard. Had he? Emily's voice echoed through the room. Your strength is increasing beyond human parameters. David flexed his fingers, staring at them like they didn't belong to him. No kidding. The enemy recovered and launched another attack, but this time, David didn't hesitate. He moved faster than he should have been able to, slipping beneath the strike and driving his elbow into its ribs. The simulation crashed to the ground with unnatural force. David's breath came hard and fast. His muscles vibrated, his vision sharpening. He could hear everything, the hum of the lights, the faint breath Emily took across the room, the energy pulsing beneath the floors. The enemy got up again. David saw its next attack before it even moved. Instinct took over. Before he could think, before he could stop himself, he struck without hesitation, his hand wrapping around the enemy's throat, lifting it clean off the ground. It wasn't human strength. It wasn't even Xelari strength. It was something else. More speed, more power, more control. And that was the moment he realized it didn't belong to him anymore. Emily's voice cut through the haze. David. He barely heard her. His fingers trembled against the enemy's throat. His mind screamed at him to let go, but his body didn't want to, because this wasn't just instinct anymore. This was hunger. Emily's hand touched his arm, a single touch, and just like that, the fire snapped back into place. David gasped, as if breaking the surface of deep water. His grip loosened, and the hologram flickered out of existence. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His hands were still shaking. He turned to Emily, breathless. What the hell was that? Emily's black eyes were unreadable. The bond reacting. David exhaled sharply. That wasn't me. Emily studied him. It is part of you now. David dot. And what happens if I lose control? Emily hesitated. Then you will become something neither Xelari nor human can predict. David swallowed hard, because deep down, he already knew he was on the edge of something irreversible, and if he crossed that line, he might not come back. David's hands still trembled. The fire inside him, the surge of something not human, still coiled beneath his skin like a living thing. He could feel it pressing against the edges of his control, waiting, daring him to let go again. He had felt powerful, and for a split second, he had wanted to lose himself in it. Emily was still watching him, her black eyes dark and unreadable. She hadn't moved since she pulled him back, since her touch had severed the instinct that had nearly consumed him. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You are changing faster than anticipated." David exhaled hard. "Yeah? No kidding." He took a slow step back from the center of the training chamber, forcing his breathing to steady. His body still buzzed with the aftershock of whatever the hell that had been. Emily studied him carefully. What did it feel like? David swallowed. How the hell was he supposed to explain it? Like power, like hunger, like his body had stopped waiting for permission and simply taken control. It had felt natural in a way that scared the hell out of him. He flexed his fingers, still feeling the ghost of that strength in them. "Like I wasn't in control anymore," he muttered. "Like I could have snapped that thing in half without even thinking about it." Emily tilted her head slightly. "But you didn't." David's jaw tightened. "Only because you stopped me." Then Emily took a slow step forward. "The bond is stabilizing, but your mind is still fighting it." David scoffed. "Fighting? No, Emily. This is me trying not to become a monster." Her black eyes remained steady. "A monster does not stop." David exhaled sharply. His whole body was still wired, still on edge. He wanted to believe that, but something inside him, the same part of him that had almost snapped a second ago, wasn't so sure. Emily studied him, then finally spoke. "We need to continue." Let David out a sharp laugh. "Continue? You just saw what happened. You need to understand yourself." The certainty in her voice stopped him. "David. And what happens if I lose control again?" Emily's gaze didn't waver. "Then I will stop you again." David. "This is humane." But he stepped back into the center of the chamber anyway, because she was right. If he didn't understand what he was becoming, someone else would decide for him. The next test was different. Emily didn't summon another holographic enemy. Instead, the lights in the chamber shifted, dimming into a strange, low glow. The room felt smaller, heavier, as if the very air had thickened around them. David frowned. "What's happening?" Emily's voice was even. "Your mind has been resisting the bond, keeping it from fully settling. We are going to remove that barrier." David. "And how the hell do we do that?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she raised a small device, a sleek, metallic construct with faintly pulsing blue lines, and pressed it to his temple. A rush of heat flooded through him. David staggered, his breath catching. His vision blurred, then sharpened too much. Suddenly, he could see everything. The faint energy patterns running through the walls, the microscopic shifts in Emily's posture, the soft rise and fall of her breath. It was like a filter had been lifted, like his entire body had awakened to something far beyond human perception. David gasped, gripping his head. "What the—" Then he felt it. Something deep, buried in his chest. Not just his heartbeat, but hers. Emily. Not just her presence. Not just awareness, something deeper. He could feel her thoughts skimming across his own, could sense the way she was watching him, not with her eyes, but with something more intimate. The bond was wide open. David stumbled back, his pulse hammering. No, this isn't right." Emily took a step closer. "It is what you are." David clenched his fists. "You should have warned me. You wouldn't have agreed," she said simply. His breath came hard, his whole body shaking. The fire inside him had never felt stronger, but it wasn't just his anymore. It was hers too. And the realization sent a violent shudder through his entire body. "Make it stop," he rasped. Emily didn't. She simply waited, watching him with unnerving patience. David's vision flickered again, the walls of the chamber warping in his mind. The room felt too small, too hot, his body buzzing with something more than power now. It was connection, and it was terrifying. Emily's voice was calm but firm. "Let it settle." David couldn't. It was too much, too close. His pulse roared, the fire surging up through his chest, demanding more. He could feel her energy, could feel the raw power between them. Could a sudden impact slammed through his skull. David collapsed to his knees. The world tilted sideways. His body convulsed, his vision whiting out. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Emily's voice, low and steady. "You are resisting again." "Because I don't want this." Emily crouched down, her black eyes locking onto his. "You already have it." David gasped as another wave of heat pulsed through him. This time, he He couldn't fight it. He let go, and the moment he did, everything changed. The fire didn't burn, it flowed. The pressure in his chest didn't suffocate. It expanded. The awareness of Emily didn't feel like an intrusion anymore. It felt like a part of him had just clicked into place. His breath evened out. His body stilled, and when he opened his eyes, they weren't just his anymore. Emily exhaled softly. Good. Everything felt clearer, sharper, balanced. He swallowed hard. What the hell just happened? Emily studied him. You stopped running from yourself. David exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his hair. His body felt right for the first time since waking up in that med bay. He was still him, but not just him anymore. He met Emily's gaze. So, now what? Emily tilted her head slightly. Now, we see what you really are. David swallowed hard, because for the first time, he wasn't afraid of losing control anymore. He was afraid of what he might do now that he had it. David's breath steadied, but the fire inside him didn't fade. It had settled, no longer a raging, uncontrollable force, but something deeper, something alive. The moment he stopped resisting, it became part of him, woven into his very being. And now, for the first time, he felt complete. Emily stood before him, her black eyes watching carefully. How do you feel? David. His body still hummed with energy, but it no longer felt foreign. It felt natural. Different, he admitted, but in control. Emily's lips curved ever so slightly. Good. Now, let's see how much. She didn't wait for his response. In a blur of motion, she attacked. David barely had time to think. His body moved on its own, reacting faster than his mind could process. He dodged as Emily's strike came for his ribs, twisting just enough to avoid impact. She was fast, but he was faster. His muscles tensed, his senses sharp. He felt her movements before she made them, the bond between them acting like an unspoken warning system. Emily pivoted, sending a second strike toward his chest. David caught her wrist. Their eyes locked. For a split second, neither of them moved. David could feel her pulse beneath his fingertips, the heat of her skin, the tension in her stance. The bond between them wasn't just awareness anymore. It was something deeper, something primal. Emily exhaled, not pulling away. Impressive. David's grip tightened slightly. I knew you were going to do that. Emily nodded. Yes, your instincts have evolved. David swallowed. So this is what I am now? Emily held his gaze. This is only the beginning. David let go of her wrist, stepping back. His body still thrummed with a strange need, not for violence, not for control, but for understanding. He exhaled. So, what's next? Emily's expression remained unreadable. Now? You prove to the council that you're worth keeping alive? David smirked. No pressure, huh? Emily's black eyes gleamed. Not at all. David flexed his hands, exhaling. He was ready. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what he had become. He was ready to use it. David stood at the threshold of the council chamber, his body thrumming with restrained energy. Emily's words still lingered in his mind. Now, you prove to the council that you're worth keeping alive. He wasn't afraid not anymore. He had spent his whole life surviving, adapting, pushing past limits. This was no different. Emily walked beside him, silent, unreadable, but he felt her presence in a way that was more than just physical. The bond between them pulsed beneath his skin, a constant connection humming at the edge of his mind. Then the massive doors slid open, and David stepped inside. The council was waiting. Councillor Riven sat in the center, his expression sharp and unmoving. Human, he said, his voice even. You have undergone changes. David met his gaze without flinching. Yeah, you could say that. A murmur rippled through the room. Riven leaned forward slightly. The question is, can you control it? David exhaled. Guess we're about to find out. Riven nodded once. Then, without warning, he lifted his hand. A signal. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. Tall, violet-skinned, armed. David tensed as he recognized the warrior standing before him. Commander Zyros, the Xelari who had promised to end him. Zyros smirked, his black eyes gleaming. Let's see what you really are. Then, without hesitation, he attacked. David's instincts exploded. Zyros was faster than any human opponent David had ever faced. But David was faster. He moved before he thought, dodging Zyros' strike by a hair's breadth, pivoting on instinct. The air cracked with the force of the missed blow, the warrior's strength inhumanly powerful. David reacted instantly. He struck fast, precise, brutal. His fist connected with Zyros' ribs, sending a shockwave of energy rippling through the chamber. Zyros staggered back. Murmurs erupted from the council. David exhaled, his body steady, his mind clear. He was in control. Zyros smirked, rubbing his ribs. Not bad. Then he lunged again. David met him head-on. Blow after blow, they clashed, two forces colliding, strength against speed, instinct against experience. And then, in a single smooth motion, David saw his opening. He ducked under Zyros' next attack, twisted, and drove his elbow into the warrior's chest with enough force to send him flying backward. Zyros crashed to the floor. Silence fell over the chamber. David stood tall, his breath even. His pulse still thrummed with raw energy, but he was in control. He turned to the council, his voice steady. Is that enough proof for you? Counselor Riven studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. The human lives. David exhaled. For now. But he knew this was only the beginning. David stood in the center of the council chamber, his breath steady, his muscles still thrumming with raw energy. The fight was over. Zyros was still on the ground, breathing hard, his black eyes gleaming with something that wasn't quite anger. It was respect. The room was silent. The council studied him, cold and calculating, weighing his existence like a gamble they weren't sure they wanted to take. Then finally, Counselor Riven spoke. You have proven your control. He leaned forward, his dark gaze locking onto David's. But understand this control does not make you one of us. It only makes you useful. David smirked. I'll take what I can get. A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the room, but Riven didn't react. Your existence is unprecedented. A bond between a Xelari and a human should not be possible. And yet, here you stand. David didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Riven, we will allow you to live. For now. Emily, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. And what of me? Riven's black eyes flicked toward her. You have bound yourself to something outside our species. The council will not forget this. Emily held his gaze, unmoving. Neither will I. Riven studied her for a long moment before giving a slow nod. Then, with a single wave of his hand, the meeting was over. The guards stepped aside. David was free. For the first time since waking up in the Xelari medbay, he felt something other than fear, other than doubt. He felt like himself again. But he wasn't the same. And he never would be. David and Emily walked in silence through the winding corridors of the Xelari vessel. Neither of them spoke, but neither of them had to. The bond between them was stronger than ever, woven deep into their very beings. David exhaled, glancing sideways at her. So, what now? Emily didn't stop walking. Now, we wait. David frowned. For what? She looked at him then, her black eyes deep, unreadable. To see what you will become. David swallowed. He had proven himself today. But something told him the council's decision wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. He didn't know what he was yet, didn't know what the bond had truly done to him. But he was still alive. And for now, that was enough.